Thank you for coming to listen to me speak. It's a nice, intimate room for the number of people in here, so get cozy. This is my first time speaking, so thank you, I guess, to DevOps as well for giving me the opportunity. I'm a front-end developer at a company called Gogita, who are still very much in the startup stages. We're 12 months old and we've gone from 5 engineers to 25 engineers in the last 4 months, and I think we're planning the same trajectory for about the next 18 months. So I will come on to that later, though, otherwise my boss will tell me off. So what I wanted to talk about is why designers should be considered part of the development team. And this is something that I've experienced in quite a few companies where there seems to be this disconnect between designers and developers. And so I just want to talk about why I think that causes some friction and some ideas around how we can maybe look at it a bit differently. So I think most people have this concept that as developers and within tech, we're really, really good at, we test code and then we merge it. And yet there's so many times where actually this doesn't happen. And the main time this happens, in my opinion, is when it comes to things like user experience. So I think most people will say the first step that we've got in a deployment pipeline is we run automated tests. Great. Unit tests pass, and maybe we merge into main. All seems perfectly legit at this point. We deploy out to a development environment or a pre-production environment. And then, hopefully, we then have a product manager go into that environment and test the code and test that it actually does what we wanted it to do. And that a designer maybe even tests it, that it actually looks right. Well, hopefully at that point then we'll deploy into production. But why are we merging into main before we've actually tested the code, that it does the right thing? Because unit tests are only ever going to test a certain percentage of what code should do. They'll only test that it maybe functionally meets the acceptance criteria. But as a user, I don't know about you, but it's as often that I'm complaining about the experience of using the website than I am about a button not necessarily working when I click it. So what could go wrong? Well, what happens when we're in a situation that we've deployed this code into main, it's gone into a production environment, into a pre-production environment or a development environment, and a bug happens? Maybe it's something as trivial as the button on a color, the color on a button even is wrong. But it could be something much, much more serious, which I've got a couple of examples later around how UX bugs can actually cost an awful lot of money. But this also prevents actually having continuous deployment. We have such a desire in back-end code we raise pull requests, we pass the tests, that gets merged after a pull review, a code review. That goes into an environment, we maybe run more automated tests in that environment, great, it then goes into production. Awesome, this works amazingly well for back-end code because there are very, very few end users that actually go onto your API and test that it looks good. If you do, I'm quite curious as to what your website does. But on the front end, if you're testing after you've merged into production, into your main branch, there's no way you can automatically deploy that into production without having manual test steps in between. So we're trying so hard and we're spending so much money on infrastructure and on DevOps engineers to make this continuous deployment pipeline, but we're blocking things with really fundamental steps. So how does this actually relate to designers? Well, I don't know about a lot of companies, but most companies don't have the design resources to have full UX mock-ups into full clickable prototypes that can go out to users that we can garner feedback on and then get deployed. What normally happens is they go, here's a button, and this is what it looks like when you hover on it. Cool. Well, once you've implemented that, and I had this issue not long ago where button looked perfect in the rest state, it looked perfect in the hover state. It met all of the accessibility criteria, the accessibility ratios. When you hovered over it and you came off it, it looked like someone was having a disco in the middle of the web page because it was just such a difference. You can't really test that automatically. So this is something we need to bring forwards. And these mistakes can be quite trivial, like my bumblebee button that went from bright yellow to bright white every time you hovered and unhovered. But they can also be a lot worse. Citibank, about 15 years ago, had an issue where a checkbox, the contractor that was using this checkbox thought that by clicking that button that says override default settlement instruction would prevent that money leaving the bank. The two people that saw this and were responsible for reviewing it thought that by clicking that button would prevent a certain amount of money being blocked from going out of that bank account. The result, £900 million went to the end user. $900 million went to the end user. And as of last year, the US federal court judged, yeah, your problem, your mistake, we're not doing anything to get that money back for you. It can be really expensive because people don't know what a checkbox does. I mean, ideally, this is going to get caught in the design phase, but let's go over that because that defeats the point of my talk. Walmart put out a questionnaire. Again, this very much wouldn't be caught in the process. It's just an interesting example of really expensive mistakes. They put out a survey to their end users and their customers that said, what do you think about Walmart? Do you think it's too cluttered? And they had about 85–90% of users said, yeah, Walmart's too cluttered. So Walmart took the sensible step of saying, well, we'll take 15% of our stock out of shops. The result was they lost $1.85 billion in that year because they had less stock. It's just a really poorly worded question. What they were actually trying to say is, should we organize it a bit better, which for anyone that's been in Walmart probably doesn't need user research to ascertain, but we digress. It can also cost life. So there's two examples here, and this one was the less miserable, so I went for this one, which this checkbox at the bottom, 99% of the time on big cruise ships, they just want to steer a ship using both rudders at the same time. And so that checkbox being checked looked sensible. It meant that when they were using thrusters, everything happened at the same time, left and right, and they went in a straight line, which makes sense on the whole. The problem is that people were so used to this being checked that no one actually ever looked at it. So when someone unchecked it for what seems to be perfectly legitimate reasons, and they then went to change direction, nothing happened. And so they drove straight into something, or sailed straight into something, and they wrecked the ship. These are things that are actually really difficult to test. You couldn't test most of this in an automated unit test. You couldn't have this as a pre-pull request check, because that checkbox does exactly what it's meant to do. It makes sure both things do the right thing, same thing. These are things that you can only actually check by looking at the website and interacting with it. And a lot of companies that I've experienced anyway, once they've merged into main, they go, oh, well, we have continuous deployment. We're going to automatically get that into production. We might run a security test in a development environment. They never actually check that what's been made looks right and looks usable. I think these are some lovely examples that show that that can actually be really quite costly for companies if they don't do this. I wish I worked on software that had this sort of implication, but never mind. So I think we can do this better. And if you didn't think that this was where I was coming to, I think this would be a really poorly structured talk. I think my first point is designers and developers can be friends. I'm not sure why there seems to be this environment that has permeated so many companies that designers work in their design bubble and they speak to your product manager. The product manager comes to developers and goes, here's what we're going to build. And we go, okay. And we make it. And then designers are already working on the next thing. But we've changed that in back-end development. We've moved to DevOps. We've brought operations and security. We've shifted left. And yet the bit that the customers actually use, the interface, is still this siloed holy grail that cannot be touched. And I just don't think it makes any sense. And I think when you look at a lot of modern infrastructure and you look at things like Next.js, which automatically will create you preview branches on any pull request, there's sort of no excuse to not checking that you've made the right thing and that that thing works before you merge the code. It doesn't take long. Like, we're all hopefully in the practice of making pull requests that are really small. So it's what, a minute for a product manager to go in and go, oh yeah, that button looks good. Or what on earth does that checkbox do? Because that just looks so wrong. Doesn't take much time. But by capturing it at that stage, and I think, if you go back to the keynote talks this morning with accessibility, they sort of hammered this point of how much cheaper it is to catch things at this stage than it is in production. Well, we've sort of got a lifeline here to catch things before we merge them. And I think there needs to be a lot more time and effort thought into how do we get this involved in the lifecycle? How do we make developers and designers and product managers all play for the same team rather than just wearing the same logo on their shirt? I think something that we've sort of heavily pushing at Gogita at the moment is every team has a dedicated designer and product manager. And every time that we work through things, like I probably every day will send about 2 or 3 preview links to the product managers and to the designer and say, hey, what do you think? Or I send a screenshot, or I do something that just lets them see the visual impact. And by doing that, we do it with developers, we pair program. Well, let's do that with designers. Because how often is it that as a designer that you've worked with that goes, oh, actually, yeah, that doesn't look good once you've implemented it. Because they've done it on this 1280 pixel screen that's perfect. But as soon as it's different to that, they go, oh, that looks pants. Well, let's work with them on that. Why? Let's not silo them and silo ourselves into making these mistakes. That's all really I wanted to say was we're a team. Let's work as a team across the stack, not just in the back-end DevOps stack. My boss walked in a couple of minutes after that I started, so just so I don't get told off. We also have a really interesting stand down, and we've got the best LEGO competition in the building. Don't tell Citibank I said that, but sorry, Capital One. Come and have a chat to us. We are hiring across the range. As I said, we've just gone from 5 to 25 engineers in the space of about 6 months. And I think the aim is to be at over 100 engineers in the next 6 to 12 months. So come and speak to us. We've got some amazing opportunities from junior through to senior and principal role levels. And yeah, hope to see some of you down there. Thank you.